Those iron gates stood tall before her, and Grace had no idea if they marked the way to salvation or damnation. A mean Montana wind howled across the plains, biting at her face. Behind those gates was a warm house and maybe a little mercy. Behind her was nothing but a brutal winter that had a way of swallowing people whole. The man who found her, Jonathan Hale, had eyes as cold as a February storm. He looked her right in the face and said, "I need a mother for my sons. You need a place to stay. This is not about love. It is a practical arrangement. My boys get a mother, and you get a roof over your head. Do we have an understanding?" Pride told her to walk away, but survival whispered a different story. Now, if you want to see if a desperate bargain can turn into something more, you stick with me. Go on and hit that like button and let me know in the comments what town you're listening from. It all started about 3 weeks earlier in a little town called Timber Falls. Grace had been a school teacher there for 2 years. She poured her heart into teaching kids who did not have much of a future. She truly believed that education could give every child a chance for a better life. That belief was what kept her going through the low pay and the lonely nights. Then a rancher named Silas Garrett stormed into her one-room schoolhouse. His son, Thomas, was a 14-year-old boy who was struggling with his arithmetic. Silas was a big man with a quick temper, and he was angry. "You putting fancy ideas in my boy's head?" he demanded. "He needs to learn his place, not do calculations." Grace stood her ground. "I am just teaching him mathematics, Mr. Garrett. Skills that will help him in life." But Silas would not hear it. He grabbed his son and pulled him out of the school. "You stay away from my boy, Miss Whitfield," he warned. That argument was the beginning of the end for Grace. Within a week, several other families pulled their children from her class. Soon after, the school board, which was full of Silas Garrett's buddies, called a meeting. The chairman, Edgar Morrison, could not even look her in the eye. He told her the board found her teaching methods divisive. They had decided to terminate her employment, effective immediately. They had already hired his nephew as a replacement. Just like that, her entire life came apart. She had no job, no home, and no references. Winter was setting in hard, and she had nowhere to go. She tried to find other work in town, but every door was shut. The saloon owner made her an offer that made her sick to her stomach. Mr. Chen at the general store quietly suggested she try the ranches. "Some of them hire help for cooking and cleaning," he told her. "It is not much, but it comes with a room." So Grace packed her few belongings into a single bag and left Timber Falls on foot. The first 2 ranches turned her away. One wife was jealous, and the other rancher was a bachelor whose eyes made her skin crawl. By the 3rd day, a real cold had set in, and desperation was right there with it. She had eaten her last piece of bread that morning. That is when she saw the gates to the Hale Ranch. They were made of wrought iron, set in stone pillars that spoke of real money. She pushed on, thinking a big place like that must need workers. But the wind picked up, driving snow in her face until she could barely see. Her legs felt like lead, and she finally stumbled and fell against a fence post, just wanting to rest for a moment. The next thing she knew, a man's voice was pulling her back. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" A weathered face was looking down at her with worried eyes. "Lord have mercy, you are half frozen." The man said his name was Charlie, the ranch foreman. He was gentle as he helped her up. "What in the world are you doing out here?" he asked. "I was looking for work," she mumbled. Charlie shook his head. "Well, I cannot leave you out here to freeze. Let's get you to the main house. The boss might know what to do." He practically carried her down the long road to a huge house built of stone and timber. Smoke was curling from 2 chimneys, promising warmth inside. He took her into a big kitchen where a kind-looking woman named Mrs. Brennan immediately took over. The housekeeper wrapped Grace in a warm blanket and gave her some hot cider, scolding her like a mother hen. "You foolish girl wandering around in a storm like this. What were you thinking? Slow down now. You will make yourself sick drinking that fast." Charlie told Mrs. Brennan that the young woman needed to see the boss right away, that she was in no condition to be traveling. Grace sat in that warm kitchen, the feeling slowly creeping back into her fingers and toes. Through a door, she heard the happy sounds of children, their little voices mixing with a deeper one. It was so normal, so full of life, it made her heart ache for everything she had lost. This was more than a joke. It was the rhythm of a family, a place to belong. Charlie came back a little out of breath. "The boss will see you in his study." When she followed him, she noticed the hallway smelled of clean wood and beeswax. The study was filled with books and warmed by a fire. Behind a large desk sat Jonathan Hale. Grace thought he looked like he was carved from the land itself, hard, weathered, and tough. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair just starting to gray at the sides and eyes a startling blue. He looked up, and Grace felt the weight of his gaze. This was a man who saw everything. "I am Grace Whitfield," she said, trying to stand tall. "I apologize for intruding, Mr. Hale. I was looking for work when the storm hit." "You are the school teacher from Timber Falls," he said. It was not a question. Her stomach dropped. He knew about her. "I make it my business to know what happens in this valley," he continued. "I know Edgar Morrison dismissed you, and I know why." He motioned to a chair. "Sit down before you fall down, Miss Whitfield." "You have no family?" Jonathan asked. "They are gone, sir. No one is left." He leaned back, studying her with an intensity that was unnerving. "I already have a housekeeper, and my ranch hands are the best in the state. I have no position to offer you." The words hit her like a physical blow, crushing the last piece of hope she had. "I see. Then if you could just spare a little food, I will be on my way." "I was not finished," he cut in. "I have no job for you. However, I have a different proposal." Then he said the words that changed her entire world. "I need a mother for my sons. You need a place to live. I am proposing marriage, Miss Whitfield." Grace stared, certain she had heard him wrong. He explained it plainly, like a business deal. His wife died 3 years ago, right after their youngest was born. His boys, Eli and Caleb, needed a mother's influence, not just a housekeeper. "This is not about love," he said, his voice flat. "I love my wife. That chapter of my life is closed. This is a practical arrangement. I know you stood up to Silas Garrett, even when it cost you everything. I know you are educated and desperate. You have no other options, and my sons need a mother. We can help each other." She looked at this stranger offering a loveless marriage with less emotion than ordering feed from the general store. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the alternative was freezing to death in the storm. Her choice was between a gilded cage and an icy grave. "If I agree," she said slowly, "what are the terms?" He nodded, expecting this. "A 1-year commitment, at least. If it does not work out after a year, I will give you enough money to start over somewhere else." When she asked about his sons, a brief flicker of warmth touched his eyes. "Eli is 7 and too serious. Caleb is 3 and a ball of pure sunshine." Grace found a strength she did not know she had. "I want your word that you will treat me with respect and never raise a hand to me." "You have my word," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I am not a gentleman, Miss Whitfield, but I am not a brute, and I will need your full support in raising the boys," she added. "Agreed. In all things concerning the children, we will be a united front. The circuit judge comes through in 3 days. We will marry then. Until that time, Mrs. Brennan will prepare a room for you. Your new life starts now." "Do we have an agreement?" Jonathan Hale's voice was as steady as the calloused hand he offered her. Grace looked at that hand, the hand of a man who had built a ranching empire from Texas dust. Taking it meant walking a path that scared her spitless. Refusing it meant turning back to the storm of ruin she had just escaped. She thought of her students, their faces bright with hope. She heard her mother's voice in her memory. "Survive, Grace. You do whatever it takes to survive." She took his hand. "We have an agreement." The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, clucked over her all the way to a guest room, saying she had seen drowned rats in better shape. The room was simple, with a thick quilt on the bed and a window looking out over the endless, dusty plains. Mrs. Brennan brought warm water and a soft flannel nightgown. "This belonged to Mrs. Hale," the housekeeper said softly. "She would have wanted it used." Grace wanted to refuse, but her own dress was in tatters. She washed away 3 days of dirt and grime and slipped on the gown. It was too long, but it was warm. When Mrs. Brennan returned with a tray of hot stew and fresh bread, Grace had to ask, "What was she like?" "Mrs. Hale," the housekeeper sighed, settling into a chair. "Sarah, she was pure sunshine. She made this big house a home. The master, he was a different man with her. Softer. They were deeply in love." Grace asked, "What happened to her?" Mrs. Brennan's eyes welled up. "The birth was hard. The doctor did all he could, but we lost her. The master blames himself. He just shut down after that. This house has been just a building ever since. Grace finally understood the emptiness in Jonathan's eyes. He was not a cold man. He was a man frozen by grief. "And the boys?" she prompted. "Sweet children." Eli took it the hardest. He grew up overnight. Caleb, the little one, he's never known his mother. The housekeeper looked at her directly. "The master told me about your arrangement. Miss Whitfield, this is hard country. Folks do what they must. The question is not if this is right, but if you are strong enough to see it through." Grace admitted, "I do not know." "Well, Mrs. C," Brennan said, standing, "you are about to find out." Morning came bright and hot. Grace put on her one good dress and went down to a dining room big enough to seat 20 people. Jonathan sat at the head of the table. On either side of him sat two small boys. The older one, Eli, watched her with eyes far too serious for a 7-year-old. The younger one, Caleb, was all wiggles and curiosity. "Boys," Jonathan said, not looking up from his newspaper. "This is Miss Whitfield." Grace sat down. "Hello, it is very nice to meet you both." Eli just stared, but Caleb piped up, "Are you going to be our new mama?" "Caleb," Jonathan warned, "but Papa, you said—" "I know what I said. Let the woman eat." It was the most awkward breakfast of Grace's life. She tried talking to the boys, asking about their lessons and their horses. Caleb chattered away, but Eli answered in single words, if he answered at all. After the meal, Jonathan announced he had business and told Eli to show her the ranch. As soon as he was gone, the little boy looked at her. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly. Grace knelt to his level. "You are right, this is strange for all of us. But your father offered me a safe place to stay, and I accepted. I know that is hard for you." "We do not need a new mother," he insisted. "I take care of Caleb." The words broke her heart. "I am sure you do a wonderful job," she said gently, "but you are only 7 years old. You should be playing, not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." "Someone has to," he whispered. Grace held out her arms. "May I?" Eli hesitated, then nodded, and she pulled him into a gentle hug. He trembled, trying so hard not to cry. "I am not trying to replace your mother," she whispered. "No one could, but maybe I can help you carry some of that weight." When Eli finally pulled away, his eyes were wet, but a little of the hardness was gone. "You really have no idea what you are doing, do you?" he asked. "Not a single clue," Grace admitted with a small smile. "Okay," Eli said, straightening up. "I will show you the ranch, but do not expect me to like you." "That is fair enough," she replied. The tour showed her a house that was beautiful but empty, filled with rooms that echoed with loss. Eli's room was perfectly neat. Caleb's was a happy mess of drawings and toys. "He is messy," Eli said. "He is 3, Grace answered. "Messy is his job." That almost earned her a smile. By lunch, she understood how things worked. Mrs. Brennan ran the house, and a foreman named Charlie ran the ranch. Jonathan managed the business. It was a perfect machine that did not seem to need her at all. That evening, Jonathan called her to his study. "The judge will be here the day after tomorrow," he said bluntly. "We will have a small ceremony right here, just us, Mrs. Brennan, and Charlie as witnesses. This is not that kind of wedding." The cold, practical words stung. He pushed a document across the desk. "This is our agreement. I want everything in writing to protect us both." It was a business contract, outlining her duties and the financial terms. "There is one more thing," he said, pulling out a small box. Inside was a simple gold band. "This was my mother's ring." Grace took it without hesitation. "I will wear it. If I am to play a part, I should look the part." The ring was too big, spinning loosely on her finger. "I will have it swathed on these," he said. "It is fine," she replied, suddenly bone-tired. "Is there anything else?" "Just one thing," Jonathan said, his face impossible to read. "Once we are married in public, we must appear to be a devoted couple. To the outside world, they had to look like a family." Grace knew the boys needed a steady home, and the town needed to see this marriage as real. She was being asked to pretend she was in love with a stranger. Jonathan corrected her, saying they just needed to act like a married couple. Their eyes met for a second, and she saw he understood how hard this would be. 2 days later, she would be Mrs. Hale. Grace walked upstairs knowing nothing could truly prepare her for this new life. She was becoming a wife and mother to a man whose heart belonged to his first love. But with a winter storm raging outside, she knew survival sometimes meant making an impossible choice. The morning of the wedding was cold and clear. Grace woke up with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. In just a few hours, she would tie her life to a man she had known for less than 3 days. She would promise to raise children who were not her own and step into a life she did not understand. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, brought breakfast in a dress. She said Grace could not get married in her worn-out clothes. The dress had belonged to Sarah, Jonathan's first wife. It was a beautiful, deep blue wool, and Grace felt the heavy weight of the life she was about to inherit. Mrs. Brennan assured her that Sarah would have wanted her things to be used, not stored away. Grace forced herself to eat and then put on the dress with trembling hands. It was a little loose, but would have to do. At 10 o'clock, the ceremony was set to begin in Jonathan's study. Grace walked down the stairs, her legs feeling weak. She heard Jonathan's deep voice and the unfamiliar sound of the judge who had come to marry them. From the landing, she looked out at the vast, snow-covered ranch that was now her home. This strange and quiet house was her only refuge from the world. She could still walk out the door, but she had nowhere else to go. She continued down the stairs. The study furniture was pushed back to make room. Judge Whitcomb, a man in his 60s, stood by the fire. He looked like a man who had seen it all. Mrs. Brennan and one of the boys, Charlie, stood by as witnesses. Jonathan waited in the center of the room, looking stern in a dark suit. He gave Grace a quick, assessing glance as she entered. The judge cleared his throat and asked if they were ready to begin. Jonathan confirmed he wanted the ceremony to be as brief as possible. The judge simply nodded and opened his book. Grace barely heard the words as he read. She was in a stranger's study, wearing a dead woman's dress, about to marry a man who only wanted a caretaker for his children. The judge asked, "Jonathan Ezekiel Hale, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Jonathan's voice was flat as he said, "I do." Then the judge turned to her. "Grace Ann Whitfield, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" This was her last chance to say no. "I do," Grace heard herself say. Jonathan took her hand. His touch was cold and impersonal as he slid his mother's ring under her finger. It was too big. The judge spoke again. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He closed his book. "You may kiss the bride." Grace looked at Jonathan, who seemed just as surprised. After a long, awkward moment, he leaned down and gave her a quick, formal kiss on her forehead. The judge offered a dry congratulations, and the paperwork was signed. Just like that, Grace was standing in the study as Mrs. Jonathan Hale. The name felt as strange as the ring on her finger. "Papa, is she our mama now?" The younger boy, Caleb, ran into the room full of excitement. His older brother, Eli, followed behind him, his face impossible to read. "Yes, Caleb," Jonathan said. "Miss Whitfield is now Mrs. Hale, your new mother." Caleb turned to Grace. "Can I call you Mama?" The question went straight to her heart. "If you would like to," she said. Caleb threw his arms around her waist in a tight hug. Over the boy's head, Grace saw Eli watching them before he turned and walked out of the room. Jonathan started to call him back, but Grace stopped him. "Let him go," she said softly. "He just needs some time." Mrs. Brennan announced that lunch was ready, breaking the tension. The meal was quiet and strained, except for Caleb, who never stopped talking. But he offered nothing. Eli just stared at his plate, refusing to look up. After the meal, Jonathan simply stood and announced, "I have work to do. Mrs. Hale, you should probably start getting settled." He said her new name like he was testing a strange word. Then he walked out, leaving Grace with the cold reality of her choice. An hour later, Mrs. Brennan found her staring out at the snow. "Having second thoughts already?" the housekeeper asked gently. "And third and fourth," Grace admitted. "I don't have the first clue what I am supposed to do here. You are a wife and a mother now. You will figure it out as you go, just like everyone else." Mrs. Brennan sat with her mending. "The master moved your things into the mistress's chambers." Grace's head whipped around. "What? He promised me my own room. He promised this was not for show, but the staff will talk, and talk spreads. You are married, we are saying. You share a room even if you do not share a bed." The housekeeper's face softened a bit. There is a sitting room connected to it with a daybed. It is very comfortable. No one needs to know the details. Grace felt a chill. She was an intruder in a dead woman's life. The mistress's chambers were on the second floor. Sarah's presence was everywhere, from the delicate wallpaper to the scent of lavender in the air. "The master has not changed a thing," Mrs. Brennan said softly. "I think he could not bear to. But that means it is all yours to make your own now, Mrs. Hale." Grace had to get used to that name. In the huge wardrobe, her own small collection of belongings looked sad and out of place. She had only 2 worn dresses, her mother's Bible, and a few books. The difference between her old life and this new one was a painful sight. "The master said you can use Sarah's things," Mrs. Brennan added. "We can alter the dresses, and there is household money for anything else you need. You are the mistress here now." The idea of having that kind of authority felt wrong. Grace had always scraped by with nothing. "Where is Eli?" she asked, changing the subject. "Probably in the barn. He goes there when he is upset, talks to one of the horses." Grace nodded. "I should go see him." "Give the boys some time," Mrs. Brennan advised. "You just turned his whole world upside down." Grace felt restless and explored the grand house. She found a library with walls full of books and comfortable leather chairs. She picked up a book of Shakespeare and was instantly lost in its pages. For the first time in years, she was reading just for herself. She did not know how much time had passed until a small voice asked, "What are you doing?" It was Caleb, the younger boy. "I am reading. Do you like stories?" His face lit up. "Mrs. Brennan tells me stories about dragons. Would you like me to read one to you?" He nodded and climbed right into her lap. Grace's heart ached with a sudden warmth. This little boy who had lost his mother accepted her so easily. She found a book of fairy tales and began reading, making funny voices for the characters. Caleb giggled when she made a dragon roar. She was so focused that she did not see Eli standing in the doorway until Caleb shouted, "Eli, come listen. Mama is reading to us." Eli froze. "She is not our mama." "Yes, she is," Caleb insisted. "Papa said so." "She is our new mother," Eli corrected, his voice tight. "That is different. Our real mama's gone." "Eli," Grace said softly, "you are absolutely right. I am not your real mother, and I could never replace her." The boy looked surprised that she agreed with him. "But I am here now," she continued, "and I would really like to be your friend. A new friend does not replace an old one. It just means you have one more." "I do not need a friend," Eli mumbled, but his voice trembled. "Everyone needs friends," Grace said, holding his gaze. "I know you have been strong for your little brother for a long time, but maybe you can let someone else help carry that weight now." Eli's face crumpled, and he turned and ran from the room. That night at dinner, the silence was heavy. Jonathan barely spoke a word. Grace tried to start a conversation, but it went nowhere. Afterwards, Jonathan vanished into his study. Grace felt completely useless. She was a wife and a mother, but she had no idea how to be either. Later that night, around 9 o'clock, Jonathan came out of his study and found her staring into the fireplace. I was wide awake, my mind still spinning from the first day of being Mrs. Hale. Grace sat up straighter. "May I ask you something?" "Of course," Jonathan replied. "What is it you expect from me?" "Mrs. Brennan runs this house perfectly. The boys have their routine. I feel unnecessary." He considered her words. "You are meant to be their mother. That's more than a routine. It is about connection and guidance, things my sons need." He poured a whiskey, his face grim. "Mrs. Hale, I know what this arrangement is, but my sons deserve more than a broken father. You can give them what I cannot." "And what about what I need?" she asked softly. His expression was like stone. "You needed shelter and security. I am providing that." "Was there something else?" She wanted to ask for kindness, for warmth, but she had signed the papers and said the vows. "No," she whispered. "Nothing else." "Good," he said, turning to leave. He paused at the door. "Give the boys some time. They will adjust." Grace stared into the fire long after he was gone, the grand room feeling cold and empty. Upstairs, she lay in the enormous bed, wondering if she had just traded one lonely existence for another. The next morning, Mrs. Brennan arrived with lists and schedules that made Grace's head spin. Feeling overwhelmed, Grace admitted, "I know nothing about running a house this large." "Then you will learn," Mrs. Brennan said, not unkindly. "Just start making decisions. They do not have to be perfect." Grace tried, approving menus and checking supply lists, praying she was not making a mess of things. By mid-morning, she needed to escape. She found the boys in the parlor with their tutor, Miss Davies. Both Caleb and Eli looked bored to tears. Grace watched as Eli worked on his math problems with no spark of interest at all. The lessons seemed as dry as dust. "Miss Davies," Grace said, her teaching instincts kicking in. "Might I borrow the boys for the afternoon?" The tutor looked surprised but could not refuse. Once she was gone, Grace turned to the boys. "What do you two actually enjoy learning about?" Caleb piped up immediately. "Horses." Eli, more reserved, said, "I like reading about faraway places." "Excellent," Grace declared. "This afternoon we are learning about Mongolia. They have incredible horses, Caleb, and a whole empire built on horseback, Eli." For the first time, Eli looked genuinely interested. They spent the afternoon in the library, a world away from the stuffy parlor. Grace pulled books from shelves, reading about Genghis Khan. Caleb was fascinated by the tough Mongol ponies, while Eli soaked up everything about trade routes and military plans. "You are a good teacher," Eli said quietly after Caleb ran off. "Better than Miss Davies." "Thank you," Grace replied. "I have missed it." "Then why did you stop?" Grace decided on the truth. "I was a teacher in town, but some powerful people did not like what I was teaching, so they had me dismissed." Eli's young face was serious. "Is that why you married Papa? Because you had nowhere else to go?" "Yes," Grace said simply. "I was afraid, and your father offered me safety." "But you do not love him." "I do not know him well enough to love him," she answered honestly. "But I hope we can all learn to be a family." Eli looked down. "I heard Mrs. Brennan say you are very brave." "I feel terrified most of the time," Grace confessed. He hesitated. "My mama used to say that being brave is just being scared and doing it anyway." Grace's throat felt tight. "Your mama sounded very wise." "She was," Eli whispered. "I am trying not to forget her voice." "Would you like to tell me about her?" Grace asked gently. "I would love to hear." And so the boy began to share memories of his mother, painting a picture of the woman whose place Grace now held. At dinner, Jonathan found his sons chattering with excitement, showing him maps they had drawn. "What happened to your regular lessons?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Mama taught us about Mongolia," Caleb announced proudly. Jonathan's gaze shifted to Grace. "The boys needed to be engaged, not just drilled," she explained. "History, geography, and culture can be a grand story if you tell it right." "And you are qualified to teach them?" The question stung, but his tone was level. "I taught for 2 years. These boys are bright, and they need to be challenged." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. "Continue then. If you feel Miss Davies is not enough, you may change the arrangement." It was a small victory, but it felt huge. Later that night, he found her in the library. "You are good with them," he stated, not asking. "I'm a teacher," she said. "It is what I do." "Sarah was good with them too," he said, his voice distant. "I worried no one could fill her role." "I am not trying to fill her role," Grace said softly. "I am creating my own." He seemed to approve of that. "The boys do not need a ghost." "Tell me about her," Grace urged. "About Sarah. If I am to be part of this family, I need to understand its story." He was silent for so long she thought he would refuse. Then he began to speak. "We met when I was 23. She was 19. She was light, pure joy. She found wonder in everything. I was already too serious, and she balanced me." A faint smile touched his lips. "I was terrible at courting her. Finally, I just asked her straight out if she would marry a rancher with more ambition than sense. She laughed and said yes." "You were happy," Grace stated. "Happier than I knew was possible." His voice grew rough. "When Caleb was born, there were problems. The doctor said there was nothing he could do. She knew she was dying. Her last words to me were, 'Take care of our boys. Do not let grief make you hard.'" His voice broke. "I have failed that promise every single day since." He had done this for his sons, and for Sarah, the woman who had given them so much love. Jonathan looked at Grace, a flicker of surprise. surprise in Oz eyes. You see things more clearly than I gave you credit for. I am a teacher. Understanding people is what I do. She then took the boys outside, insisting that fresh air was as important as books. As she walked by, he gently took her wrist. Thank you, he said quietly. The boys have not been this full of life in months. His touch was warm, and for a brief second, Grace felt a connection that went beyond their arrangement. It was a dangerous feeling for her carefully protected heart. The following days settled into a new routine. Grace filled the quiet halls with lessons and laughter. They learned about plants in the fields and practiced math by measuring fences. The house slowly transformed from a silent memorial into a living home. Jonathan watched it all, his expression unreadable. At night, Grace lay in bed and wondered if she would ever truly belong on this ranch, or if she would always just be the woman who came after. 3 weeks later, Grace was jolted awake by the sound of men shouting in the dark. She rushed to the window and saw lanterns cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. Jonathan was already outside, his body rigid with fury as he spoke to his foreman, Charlie. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, met her in the hall. Rustlers, she explained, her face grim. They hit the north pasture, killed 2 of our men, and stole nearly 50 cattle. The master is riding out to track them. Grace's heart pounded with fear. As Jonathan left, his 2 young sons appeared, their faces pale. Where is Papa going? Eli, the older boy, asked. Grace knelt and pulled them close. Your father is taking care of some trouble. He will be back soon. Now let us build a fort in the library and read stories until he returns. 7-year-old Eli stared out at the horizon, his eyes filled with a fear no child should know. Grace knew that look, the terror of losing another parent. He'll come back, she said softly. Your father is strong. Eli's voice was flat. Mama said she was coming back too. Grace had no words for that kind of hurt, so she just sat with him. The day dragged on. Mrs. Brennan brought news that the men had tracked the rustlers east, but there had been no word since morning. As evening fell, a tight knot of worry grew in Grace's chest. After putting the boys to bed, she waited. Mrs. Brennan found her in the parlor near 8 o'clock. You care for him, the older woman said, looking at Grace's clenched hands. Grace protested, I barely know him. He's my husband and the boy's father. Of course, I'm concerned. Mrs. Brennan shook her head. That ain't concern, dear. That's terror. Grace felt her defenses crumble. What if he doesn't come back? The boys have already lost so much. The housekeeper's voice was gentle. And what about you? What would you lose? Grace couldn't answer. She was losing the security she had, yes, and the boy she was starting to love. But there was something more. A small hope that the quiet, grieving man she married might one day see her as more than part of a deal. I don't know, she whispered, and the not knowing scared her most of all. Just then, the sound of horses cut through the silence. Grace rushed to the window and saw Jonathan's silhouette in the lead. He was slumped in the saddle, but he was alive. Without a second thought, she ran outside. You're hurt, she cried, seeing the blood on his shirt. It's just a graze, he said, his voice raw with exhaustion. We got the cattle back. The thieves won't be bothering anyone again. The dark way he said it told Grace all she needed to know. You need that wound cleaned. Get inside. He started to argue. I can manage. Jonathan Hale, she said, her voice like steel. You will come inside right now or I will drag you. Your sons have been worried sick. Do not die from stubbornness. Behind him, a man named Charlie choked back a laugh. Jonathan just stared at her, then gave a slow nod. Yes, ma'am. In the kitchen, as she cleaned the bloody gash across his ribs, she asked, Who did this? His jaw tightened. One of the rustlers. They chose to fight instead of surrender. We had no choice, boys. Grace didn't judge. This was a hard country. They died protecting what's mine, he said, his voice rough with guilt. That's on me. No, Grace said firmly, that's on the men who pulled the trigger. She met his gaze. By that thinking, you're also responsible for every good thing that happened to them. You don't get to claim only the bad, Jonathan. Something softened in his eyes. You have a way of cutting through the nonsense. It's a teacher's skill, she replied, tying off the bandage. You will rest tomorrow. Your sons need you alive. Jonathan caught her wrist, his touch firm but gentle. His thumb traced a circle over her pulse, sending a wave of heat through her. Grace, he said, his voice different now. Thank you for worrying about me, not just for the boys. She couldn't lie. Yes, I was worried. You may be impossible and cold, she added, but you are my husband, and I'd prefer you stay alive. A small smile touched his lips. Impossible and cold, am I? She pulled her hand away, very aware of Mrs. Brennan watching them. Now go to bed. At the door, Jonathan paused. The boys are lucky to have you, Grace. I'm starting to think I might be too. He left her standing there, her heart a mess. Well now, Mrs. Brennan said quietly, that was something. Grace knew it was not a business arrangement anymore. She was supposed to be practical, but her heart jumped when he touched her. She cared for this man. Heaven help her, she really did. Help her, she did. The next morning, the doctor confirmed Jonathan's wound was clean, but ordered him to stay in bed. Jonathan protested, but a single look from Grace silenced him. While he grumbled about the ranch falling apart, Grace ran the house and cared for the boys. When they brought him lunch, they found him buried in paperwork. Grace raised an eyebrow. I see you are resting productively, she said dryly. Someone has to keep things going, Jonathan replied, his eyes twinkling as they met hers. After shooing the boys out so he could eat, Jonathan's voice stopped her. Grace, stay a minute, please. The word please hung in the air, so rarely used by this man. She closed the door and sat by the bed. Jonathan got straight to the point. I owe you an apology for treating you like just another part of this ranch instead of a person. These last few weeks, watching you with my sons, I have been a blind fool. Grace felt a lump form in her throat. You have done more than our agreement called for, he continued. You brought this house back to life. His hand found hers. When Sarah died, something in me broke. I thought letting it heal meant forgetting her. You will never forget her, Grace said softly. She is part of your story. But she is not part of yours, Jonathan said, his thumb gently tracing her knuckles. And I am starting to think that is okay. He looked her square in the eye. This arrangement, it does not have to be just a business deal. We could make it a real marriage, a real family, for us. Grace stared at their joined hands, her world tilting. A month ago, she was desperate. Now this grieving, stubborn man was offering his heart. I need time, she whispered. Take all you need, he said, his voice warmer than she had ever heard it. I will be here. The weeks that followed were different. Jonathan started joining them for meals and reading to the boys at night. Their eyes would meet over the children's heads, sharing a new understanding. The house began to feel like a home. One afternoon, Eli asked her plainly, Do you love Papa? Grace chose her words carefully. We are learning to care for each other. Whether that becomes love, I am not sure yet. But you want it to? She asked herself. Yes, I think I do. Eli grew quiet. Mama said love is a choice you make every day. Your mama was a very wise woman. Then one night, everything changed. Grace woke to Caleb's terrified screams. She ran to his room and found him sobbing. Bad men are coming, he cried. It is just a nightmare, baby, she soothed. But then she heard it too. The thunder of hoofbeats getting closer. It was the middle of the night. Her blood ran cold. She looked at Eli, his face a pale mask in the moonlight. Get your brother and hide in the wardrobe, she ordered, her voice firm. Do not come out until your father or I get you. Grace met Jonathan in the hall. He was already holding a pistol. The boys are hidden, she said. Get to our room and lock the door, he commanded. Not a chance, Grace shot back. This is my home now, too. Just then, glass shattered downstairs. A woman screamed. They crept down the stairs to find 5 men tearing the parlor apart. The leader held Mrs. Brennan with a knife to her throat. Well now, he drawled, recognizing Jonathan. If it is not the great Mr. Hale himself, we have been waiting to have a word with you. It was Jake Mason, brother of a rustler Jonathan had dealt with. Let her go, Mason, Jonathan said, his voice dangerously calm. Your fight is with me. Model, give us everything you've got, a harsh voice snarled. A man named Mason stood in the doorway, his eyes landing on Grace. A new wife, I hear. Be a shame if she got hurt. Touch her and you'll die screaming, Jonathan said, his voice deadly calm. Big words for a man outnumbered 5-1, Mason sneered. 2 men started toward Grace. She backed up the stairs, grabbing a heavy vase. As the first one reached for her, she swung with all her might. The vase shattered against his head, and he dropped like a sack of rocks. The second man paused, giving her just enough time. She ran, not away, but straight to the boys' room. She shoved a heavy bureau against the door. "Eli," she whispered urgently, "climb down the trellis outside your window. Take Caleb. Get help from the bunkhouse. Now run, and do not look back." As they scrambled out, men began to pound on the door. The bureau would not hold for long. A heavy object slammed against the front door, splintering the wood. A man burst through the opening. Without thinking, Grace grabbed a heavy fireplace poker and swung it with all her might. She struck him hard on the shoulder, and he roared in pain, but he was much bigger. He tore the poker from her hands and hit her across the face. "You are a feisty one," he snarled. As she scrambled away, tasting blood, the front door exploded inward. Jonathan stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. His gun fired once, and the man holding Grace fell to the floor. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice tight. "Where are the boys? I sent them out the back window to find help." "Smart," he said, reloading his weapon. "There are more downstairs. Can you shoot?" He pushed a small pistol into her hands. "Point it and pull the trigger," he commanded. "Do not hesitate." They moved down the stairs together. In the main room, 2 more intruders lay on the floor. 2 others were hiding behind overturned furniture. "This is not over, Hale," a man named Mason shouted. "You will pay for what you did." "Your brother made his choice," Jonathan called back, his voice like ice. The room erupted in gunfire. Grace saw one of the men stand up to take aim. She fired her pistol. The shot went wide, but it made him duck for cover. Jonathan seized the opportunity, and his next shot found its mark. The last 2 men fled out the back door. Charlie and the other ranch hands burst in moments later. Jonathan sent them after the escaped men. Then he turned to Grace. He put his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. "You are bleeding." "It is nothing, Jonathan. I am all right." His voice cracked. "You were attacked in my home. You should have been safe." Grace reached up and touched his face. "We are alive. The boys are safe. That is all that matters." Jonathan pulled her into a sudden, desperate hug. His entire body was shaking. "When I saw that man put his hands on you," he whispered into her hair. "I know," she said, holding him just as tightly. "I know." They stood together in the middle of the wreckage, no longer strangers in a business deal, but 2 people who had found something real. "You were so brave," Jonathan said. "I had to be," she replied, looking up at him. "This is my family now. This is my home. I was not going to let them take it from me." Jonathan's voice was soft. "Grace Hale," he said at his breath catching, "you are the most amazing woman I have ever known." Before she could even answer, the front door flew open. 2 small boys launched themselves inside. "Mama, Papa," Caleb yelled, throwing himself at them while sobbing. Eli followed right behind him, his face covered in tears. Grace and Jonathan dropped to their knees, pulling the boys into a tight hug. In the middle of the chaos, as the sun began to rise, they held each other. The 4 of them were a solid circle of safety. "Everyone is safe now," Jonathan said in a firm voice. "The bad men are all gone." Eli whispered, "I was so scared they would hurt you." Grace smoothed his hair and said, "They tried, but we protect each other. That is what a family does." The word family filled the air between them. It was not a contract anymore. It was raw, built in a moment of shared danger. Jonathan's eyes met Grace's over the boys' heads. His look asked a question and gave an answer at the same time. This was real. They were real. The home she had worked so hard to fix up now looked like a battlefield. But they were all alive, and that was all that mattered. The boys would not leave their parents. Caleb stuck to Grace like glue, and Eli quietly followed Jonathan's every move. They ate breakfast in the kitchen since the dining room was a wreck. Grace saw Jonathan keep a hand on Eli's shoulder the whole time, as if to make sure his son was truly there. Later, Jonathan spoke quietly to Grace. "Charlie caught up with Mason and his men about 5 miles out. They will not be bothering anyone again." Grace knew exactly what he meant. Those men were gone for good. Justice on the Montana frontier was quick and final. She thought she should feel horrified, but all that she felt was relief. They had threatened her family. Now they could not. "Good," she said simply. By the middle of the morning, the house was full of activity. The doctor came and checked on everyone. He told Jonathan, "Well, That boy has the makings of a fine man. He kept his head when most grown men would have panicked. Jonathan looked toward Grace. He gets that from his mother. It took Grace a second to understand he was talking about her, not his first wife, Sarah. A warmth spread through her chest. By the afternoon, the shock of it all started to hit her. Grace found herself shaking while trying to hang the new curtains. Her hands were so unsteady that Mrs. Brennan gently took the fabric from her. "It is just a delayed shock," the housekeeper said with kindness. "Go rest, Mrs. Hale. We can handle this." But Grace could not rest. If she stopped moving, the terrible memories would return. She went into the library, the only room that was mostly untouched. She picked up a book, but the words would not focus. "Grace!" Jonathan stood in the doorway, his face full of concern. "You should be resting." "I cannot," she said, her voice cracking. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that man grabbing me. The gun, the blood." Jonathan crossed the room and took the book from her hands. He set it down, then gently pulled her into his arms. He just held her, letting her feel safe. "It is over," he murmured. "We are all safe." He let her cry until the shaking finally stopped. Instead of recoiling, Jonathan did something else entirely. He pulled her close with a strength that was steady and sure. He spoke quietly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It did not happen. We made it through. You made it through because you are brave and you protected what was important. Do not let fear take that away from you." Grace hid her face in his chest, taking in his scent of soap and leather. "I was so scared," she admitted. He nodded. "Me too. When I saw that man touch you, I felt a terror I had not known since Sarah passed. The terror of losing someone who matters to me." She pulled back to look into his eyes. "I matter to you? You know you do," he said. "These last few weeks, watching you bring this house back to life, seeing you with my sons. Grace, you matter more than I ever thought possible. Our deal was just supposed to be for convenience." "Let me finish," he pleaded, his hands gently framing her face. "I told you this marriage could be real. Last night proved to me that I do not just want to try to promote. I am already halfway to loving you." "We barely know each other," she whispered, tears starting to fall. "This was just a practical arrangement." He shook his head. "Arrangements do not make you fight like a wild animal for children that are not your own. Arrangements do not make your heart race like this." He took her hand and placed it over his chest, his heart thundering beneath her palm. "Tell me you do not feel it too. Just say the word and I will give you all the space you need." But Grace could not say it because she felt that same terrifying, wonderful pull toward this man. Somewhere between tutoring his sons and fighting for their lives, she had started to fall for him. "I am scared," she confessed. "I am scared of what this means, of having it only to lose it." "So am I," Jonathan said, resting his forehead against hers. "To love someone is to give them the power to break you. I know that better than anyone. But the thought of not loving you, Grace, that scares me even more." "But what about Sarah? You said you would always love her." "I will," he answered softly. "She was the mother of my sons, and a part of me will always love her. But she is gone, and I am still here. I am starting to believe that I can honor her memory and still choose to be happy. I think she would want my boys to have a mother who truly loves them and loves their father." "I do love them," Grace said. "Your boys have completely stolen my heart." "Just my boys?" he asked, his blue eyes searching hers. "No," she admitted quietly, "not just them." "Grace," he breathed her name. "May I kiss you?" A real kiss this time. "Not because we have to, but because I want to." She answered by rising to her toes and meeting his lips. It was a soft, questioning kiss at first. Then his arms tightened around her, and it became a kiss full of all the fear, relief, and hope they had both been holding inside. When they finally parted, Grace felt breathless. "Well," she said. "That was long overdue," Jonathan finished with a slight smile. "You changed me too," Grace told him. "I came here with nothing, just hoping for a roof over my head. You gave me more than shelter. You gave me a family and a place where I belong. You helped me find my courage. You were always brave," he said, kissing her forehead. "You just needed a reason to fight. Now we need to decide what to do next. Word of the attack will get to town. People will talk about us in this marriage. We must stand together." He took her hands in his. This is about protecting what is ours. Our home, our family. Let them gossip. I know what we are building here, and I will not let anyone tear it down. What are we building? She asked. A real marriage, he said firmly. A real family. Grace, I want to court you properly, the way you deserved from the beginning. Even though we are already married, I want to take the time to truly know you. I would like that, Grace said, a real smile spreading across her face. We have done everything backwards so far. Why change now? Jonathan grinned, the warmest smile she had ever seen from him. Besides, the boys will be thrilled. Caleb keeps asking when we will act like other parents. And Eli has been watching us, trying to figure out if this is real. Last night, I think we proved to him that we will fight for each other. We are a family now. Just then, Eli appeared at the door. Papa, Mama, there are people coming up the road. A lot of them. They looked out the window to see a line of wagons approaching. Grace recognized several faces from town, including Edgar Morrison from the school board, and even Silas Garrett, the man whose complaint had cost her her teaching job. What could they possibly want, she wondered aloud. To stare, most likely, Jonathan said, squeezing her hand. Or maybe to help. Remember, we faced them together. They stood on the porch, waiting. Jonathan placed his hand on the small of her back, a simple gesture that told the world she was his. Mr. Morrison was the first to speak, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale, we heard what happened. We came to see if you were all right. We are shaken, but we are fine, Jonathan replied. We brought supplies, another woman called out. Food and blankets. Our men can help with the repairs. Grace was shocked. These were the people who had cast her out, and now they were offering help. We heard how you fought them off, Mrs. Hale, said another man. That took real grit. Silas Garrett spoke up, his voice rough. You could have hidden, but you stood your ground. That is admirable. Thank you, Grace said, finding her voice. We would be grateful for the help. Then Mr. Morrison cleared his throat. Mrs. Hale, the school board has reconsidered. We acted too quickly. We would like to offer you your old position back. The offer hung in the air. Grace felt Jonathan's hand on her back, a silent promise that she was no longer alone. She had choices now. That is very kind, Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice clear and strong. But I must decline. I have a family to care for now and my own sons to teach. Mr. Morrison from the town council cleared his throat. We would be honored if you would reconsider the teaching position, Mrs. Hale. Grace looked at the townsfolk who had once turned her away. They had come to help fix the house, their faces full of guilt. She gave a small smile. Thank you, but my place is here now. I am sure you can find someone else, someone who will not be dismissed for teaching children to think. A few people had the decency to look ashamed. Grace straightened her shoulders. Now, if you truly want to help, the parlor needs new windows. The crowd broke up, finding tasks to do. You handled that well, Jonathan said quietly beside her. Papa, Mama, Caleb came running out. Mrs. Henderson brought cookies. Can we have some? After lunch, Jonathan said firmly. He then turned to Grace. Speaking of which, Mrs. Hale, perhaps you should supervise the kitchen. I think we are about to feed half the town. Grace nodded and followed Caleb inside, leaving Jonathan to manage the repairs. In the kitchen, Mrs. Brennan was already organizing food donations. The housekeeper looked at Grace's messy clothes and bruised lip. Well now, she said, you look like you have been through a war, and yet you are glowing. I am not glowing, Grace insisted, feeling her face get warm. Oh, you absolutely are. The master finally said something, did not he? Mrs. Brennan's expression softened. I am glad, Mrs. Hale. The master has been like a ghost for the past 3 years. You have brought him back to life. By evening, the house was nearly back to normal. The townspeople left with promises to visit soon. Grace and Jonathan stood on the porch watching the sunset. You turned down the teaching job, Jonathan said. I did. I have no regrets, Grace replied. Teaching was my whole life before, but that was before I found something more important. The boys need me here. You need me here. And Jonathan, I need to be here. This is my home now. This is my family. Jonathan took her hand. I am the lucky one. You saved my life. We saved each other. Grace corrected him gently. You saved me from being a ghost in my own house. They stood together as night fell over their land. A deep sense of peace settled over Grace. "A month ago," she said, "I was terrified and alone. I agreed to marry a stranger because I had no other choice. Now, I cannot imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else." Jonathan drew her closer. "Grace, I meant what I said. I want to do this right. We are already married," she pointed out with a small laugh. "Then we will make our own traditions," he said, his eyes serious. "Marry me again, not because you have to, but because we choose each other." Grace felt tears welling up. "Are you proposing again?" "I am proposing properly this time. Grace Ann Hale, will you be my wife, in your heart and in truth? Will you build this life with me because you want to?" "Yes," Grace whispered, her heart full. "Yes, I want to. I choose you, Jonathan Hale. I choose this family and this life." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise for their new beginning. That conversation changed everything. They talked for hours honestly and openly, and realized their marriage of convenience could become something real. A few days later, they gathered the boys. Jonathan knelt down to be at their level, pulling Grace down beside him. "You know your mom and I got married to help each other, right?" he began. Eli nodded cautiously. "Well, we have decided something important. We are going to have another wedding, a real one, with family and friends, because we are not just helping each other anymore. We are a real family now." "Does that mean you love Mama?" Eli asked, his voice very quiet. "Yes," Jonathan said simply. "I love her very much, and she loves me. And we both love you boys more than anything." A tear traced a path down Eli's cheek. "So you will not send her away? Not even when the year is over?" Grace's heart broke and healed all at once. That was his fear. He thought she was only temporary. She pulled him into a tight hug. I am not going anywhere," she whispered. "Not in a year, not ever. I am home. Here, there is something I want to show you." He took her to the master bedroom, a room he had kept locked since Sarah's passing. With a key, he opened the door. The room was a perfect memory from 3 years ago, with clothes in the wardrobe and books on the nightstand. The presence of a woman was in every detail. "I could not bring myself to change it," Jonathan said softly. "I could not bear to erase her memory. But keeping it this way is not good for me or the boys. It is time. What do you want to do with it all?" "I want to pack her personal things away. The boys can have them when they are older. As for the room itself," he looked straight at Grace, "I thought we could use it, make it our own, not to forget Sarah, but to show that life goes on." "Are you certain, Jonathan? This is a very big step. I am certain I cannot move forward while I am living in a shrine to the past. And I want to move forward with you." They spent the evening working together, carefully packing away dresses, jewelry, and personal items. With each piece, Jonathan shared a story. This was for their first dance. He gave her these earrings for an anniversary. This shawl was her favorite on cold nights. Grace listened and helped. She understood this was a ceremony, a way to honor what was while making space for what could be. When they were done, the bottles sat in neat stacks. The room felt different, no longer frozen in the past. "Thank you," Jonathan said, taking both of her hands. "Thank you for understanding and for not feeling threatened by her memory." "How could I be? She is the woman who made you who you are today. She gave you those wonderful boys. She is part of the reason I fell in love with you, because you are a man who can love so deeply, Grace." Jonathan pulled her into his arms. "I need you to know something. What I feel for you is not the same as what I felt for Sarah. It is not less, just different. With her, our love was easy and natural, like taking a breath. With you, our love is a choice. It was built through hardship and trust. That makes it just as real. Maybe even more so. I understand, Jonathan, and that is exactly what I needed to hear." He kissed her then, a slow and deep kiss that broke down the last walls between them. They were truly married now, not just by a piece of paper, but in every way that counted. They were partners, lovers, and parents. They were a family that started from need but was held together by choice. When they finally pulled away, breathless, Jonathan touched his forehead to hers. "We are really doing this. We are building a life together. We really are. Are you afraid?" "I am terrified. But I am also more hopeful than I have been in years." He smiled, and Grace saw it was the first real unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. "You are worth the risk, Grace Hale. You have always been worth it." They stood together in that new room as the moon climbed into the night sky. Grace knew then that every terrible thing that had brought her to this place had been worth it. The loss of her job, the bitter cold of that winter day, and the violence of the attack were all worth it. It was all worth it to find this man, these boys, and this life she never knew she wanted. Tomorrow they would tell Mrs. Brennan their plans. They would start to prepare for a real wedding, a celebration for the family they had become. They would keep building this life, one day at a time, one choice at a time. But for tonight, they just held each other. They marveled at the strange and wonderful journey that took them from being strangers to being so much more. Love, Grace realized, does not always show up in a pretty package. Sometimes it looks like survival. Sometimes it is the last choice you have when all the others are gone. But that did not make it any less real. It did not make it any less worth fighting for. She had come to this ranch for shelter, but found a home. She agreed to a marriage without love and found a love deeper than she could have imagined. She agreed to be a mother out of duty and found herself loving those children with all her heart. And the man who offered her a cold business deal had become the man who held her heart. "What are you smiling about?" Jonathan asked her. "I am just thinking about how fate works. Whatever it was that brought me to your front gate that day." "Desperation is what brought you here," he said, "but something else made you stay." "Hope," Grace said in a soft voice. "Even when I did not know it, I was hoping for this, for you, for us." "Well, I am grateful for that hope, and for a brave woman who refused to quit." Jonathan kissed her gently. "Come on," he said, "let us go to bed. Tomorrow is the start of a new chapter, and I want to be beside you when it begins." Holding hands, they left the transformed room and walked toward their future. It was uncertain and imperfect, but it was theirs. The next morning, everyone in the house could feel the change. Grace woke up in her own room, but she knew that would soon be different. The walls between her and Jonathan were coming down in every possible way. She dressed and went to the kitchen. He was already there with the boys trying to make breakfast. Mrs. Brennan was watching, trying not to laugh. "Popa is making pancakes," Caleb shouted, even though the batter in the bowl looked lumpy. "But they look funny." "They will taste just fine," Jonathan said, but he did not look so sure. Grace smiled and rolled up her sleeves. "Here, let me help you. We can make them together." They worked next to each other, their shoulders brushing. Their hands touched now and then as they reached for ingredients. It was simple and normal and absolutely perfect. Eli watched them with a quiet hope in his eyes. Caleb chattered on about nothing and everything, and his happiness filled the room. "Mrs. Hale," Mrs. Brennan said after the kitchen was clean and the boys were playing outside, "I could not help but see that something is different this morning between you and the master." Grace felt her face get warm. "Is it that easy to see? Only for someone who has been watching you two walk around each other for weeks. It is about time, if you want my opinion." The housekeeper's smile was real. "Sarah would have approved of this. You know, she always said the master needed a woman who was strong enough to stand up to him. You have proven you are that woman and so much more." "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. That means more to me than you know." "All right, then. If you are planning what I think you are planning, a real wedding this time, then we have a lot to do. We cannot have the mistress of Hale Ranch getting married in a study with only two people watching. This time, we are going to do it the right way." And just like that, the planning started. Grace had never thought she would have a real wedding. She certainly never dreamed of one after she accepted Jonathan's cold offer. But now, with his love and with their family whole, she wanted it. She wanted the celebration. She wanted to stand up in front of everyone who mattered and choose him. "We will need at least 6 weeks to do this right," Mrs. Brennan announced, taking out a pencil and paper. "We need invitations, a dress, food, and flowers, even if I have to make them grow in the greenhouse myself." "Mrs. Brennan," Grace said gently, "I do not need a big fancy wedding. I just need something with meaning. Family and friends, good food, and the man I love. Everything else is just extra." "You sound like a true romantic. But Mrs. Hale, you deserve the extras. You have earned them. Let me give you a proper wedding." Grace looked at the housekeeper's determined face and felt her face flushed. "Is it that noticeable?" Honey, only to a blind man. It's about time, I say. Mrs. Brennan's smile was warm and real. Your Sarah would have liked you. She always said the master needed a woman strong enough to stand her ground. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. That means the world to me. Well then, if y'all are fixin' to have a proper wedding this time, we've got planning to do. The mistress of Hale Ranch can't get hitched in a study. We're gonna do this right. And just like that, the plans began. Grace had never wanted a big wedding, especially after Jonathan's cold proposal. But now, with his love and their family, she wanted to celebrate it, to choose him in front of everyone. I don't need anything fancy, Grace said gently. Just family, friends, and the man I love. Spoken like a true romantic, Mrs. Brennan replied. But you deserve all the extras, dear. You've earned them. Let me give you a proper wedding. Grace looked at the housekeeper's earnest face and gave in. All right, but this is a ranch, not some palace. Trust me, when we're done, it'll be the finest palace in all of Montana. Later, Jonathan found Grace in the library, surrounded by wedding samples. He grinned. Looks like Mrs. Brennan got to you. She's a force of nature. Apparently, we're having a real wedding. Good. He sat beside her. You deserve a day about joy, not a contract. The start of our real marriage. I never thought I'd have any of this, Grace admitted softly. A home, children, a husband who looks at me like I matter. This is real, Grace. I promise you. He took her hand. And speaking of real, I have something for you. He pulled out a small box. Inside was a beautiful new ring, a small diamond that sparkled in the light. I had it made, Jonathan said. My mother's ring is yours, but I wanted something that was just from me to you. Jonathan, it's perfect. Tears welled in her eyes as he slipped it on her finger. It fit like it was made for her. Thank you, she whispered. No, he said, kissing her hand. Thank you for giving me a reason to hope again, for giving me my life back. The next few weeks were a happy whirlwind. While Grace and Mrs. Brennan planned, Jonathan made a point to court his own wife. He brought her wildflowers and truly listened when he asked about her day. They'd sit together in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying the quiet. The boys saw it all and approved. Caleb told everyone his mama and papa were in love, just like in his storybooks. One evening, Eli cornered Grace in the hall. Is it real, he asked. You really love Papa? She knelt down to his level. It's completely real. I love your father, and I love you and Caleb more than words can say. This family is the most real thing in my life. I was scared, Eli admitted in a small voice. Scared you'd leave when you didn't need us anymore. Oh, sweetheart. Grace pulled him into a hug. I will always need you. You are my son. That's what mothers do. They need their children forever. Eli held on tight. When he pulled back, his eyes were clear. Mama used to say love was a choice you make every day. She was a very wise woman. And you choose us? Every single day. Eli gave her a real, genuine smile for the first time. I choose you too. For my mama. For real. Grace's heart felt like it would burst. That means everything to me, Eli. The wedding was set for late April, when spring had finally chased winter away. The invitations went out to friends and neighbors. Grace's dress was simple cream silk, with lace from Jonathan's mother's own gown at the collar. Mrs. Brennan had insisted, saying it tied the past to the present. Something old, the housekeeper said, passing the torch from the first Mrs. Hale to the second. Grace touched the delicate lace. I hope I can live up to that. You already have, dear, just by being you. The ranch was buzzing with joy. The house was cleaned and decorated until it shined. Jonathan and Grace saw less of each other, wanting to make the wedding day special, but they passed secret notes and stole kisses like youngsters. I can't believe we're doing this, Grace said one night when they snuck a moment alone. A real wedding when we're already married, it's silly. It's perfect, Jonathan corrected, pulling her close. We did everything else backwards. Why stop now? No regrets? My only regret, he said, is that I didn't see you clearly from the start. But we have now. We have all our tomorrows. That's what matters. The night before the wedding, Grace couldn't sleep. She looked out over the moonlit ranch, amazed at how her life had changed. She came here with nothing, for a marriage that was just a deal for survival. Now she was about to celebrate a love she never dreamed of. A soft knock came at her door. It was Eli and Caleb in their nightshirts. "We couldn't sleep," Eli said. "Big day tomorrow." "Nervous?" Grace asked, opening her arms. They came to her, and the three of them looked out the window together. "A little," Eli admitted. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then we'll fix it together," Grace said, kissing his head. "That's what a family does. Tomorrow is for all of us." "Papa says tomorrow we're just telling everyone else we're a family, since we already are in our hearts," Grace explained. "You two are my sons. That's the truest thing I know." "Can we stay with you tonight?" Eli asked. Grace's throat tightened. "Of course you can." They all piled into her bed, a boy on each side of her. She lay there, feeling their warmth and their trust. This family, born from hardship, was now the truest thing in the world, and tomorrow they would celebrate it. She tucked both boys into bed that night, her heart full. These two little boys, who were strangers just a short time ago, now meant the world to her. Just before he drifted off, Eli whispered, "Mama, I'm glad you stayed, even when it was hard." "Me too, sweetheart," she said. "Me too." The next morning was their wedding day, bright and beautiful. The women from town helped Grace get ready. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who was confident and loved. The happiness came from inside her, not from the fancy dress. Mrs. Brennan dabbed at her eyes. "Now you look like a real bride marrying for love." "Thank you," Grace said, hugging her. "Thank you for believing in us." The ceremony was held in a field of wildflowers behind the house. Jonathan, Caleb, and Eli waited for her at the front. When Jonathan took her hand, he smiled, and Grace knew she had finally found where she belonged. This was not just a house. It was a home built not on a contract, but on patience, kindness, and a love she never expected to find. It felt like the entire county had gathered in the backyard of the Hale Ranch. Folks stood in neat rows, their Sunday best on full display, all to witness a love story they never saw coming. Inside, Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a woman who had married this man out of pure necessity, a desperate bargain to survive. Now she was about to walk out that door and choose him for real. When Mrs. Brennan gave her the nod, Grace stepped into the sunlight. At the end of the aisle stood Jonathan, flanked by his two sons. The look on his face when he saw her stole her breath. It was pure, unfiltered joy, aimed right at her. She never thought she would be on the receiving end of a look like that. As the minister began, his words cut straight to the heart of it all. He said they were there to witness something deeper than a legal contract. Today was about two people standing before their family and friends to choose each other, freely and without obligation. The minister turned to Jonathan. "Do you take Grace as your wife, not from need, but from love? Do you promise to cherish her and build a life with her?" Jonathan's voice was strong and clear. "I do. I choose Grace today and every day. I promise to be the husband she deserves." Then all eyes were on Grace. "And do you, Grace, freely choose this life, this family, and this man?" Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was steady. "I do. I choose Jonathan, and I choose this family. I promise to be his true partner in everything." Eli, Jonathan's oldest, stepped forward with two new wedding bands on a small pillow. These were not the simple, hurried rings from their first ceremony. Jonathan slid a gold band onto her finger. "With this ring, I wed you, not because I need you, but because I love you." Grace's hand trembled as she placed the matching ring on his finger. "With this ring, I wed you because you gave me a home, a family, and a love I never knew I needed." The minister smiled wide. "Jonathan, you may kiss your bride like you mean it this time." The crowd chuckled as Jonathan pulled Grace into a deep kiss while his boys cheered. Later, the barn was alive with the sound of fiddles, laughter, and celebration. Grace danced first with Jonathan, holding him close and feeling a sense of peace she had never known. "Happier than I've ever been," she whispered to him. He then danced with Mrs. Brennan, and Grace danced with the boys. Caleb stood on his father's feet, giggling as he was spun around. It was a perfect picture of a family made whole. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jonathan led Grace away from the party. He took her to a small, newly built gazebo overlooking the valley. "I had the men build this," he said quietly, "a place just for us." But the real surprise was inside. Carved into the wooden wall were words that made Grace's vision blur. It read, "Here stands Grace, who came in winter and brought spring, who accepted shelter and gave home, who married from need and loved from choice. Forever our heart, forever our family." Tears fell freely as she read the words he had written. "I wanted you to know how I see you," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "Woe as the desperate woman who showed up at my gate, but as the incredible woman who saved us all." He held her close and whispered, "I love you, Grace. Not because I have to, but because I choose to every single day." They returned to the party hand in hand, feeling the solid truth of the life they had built. Late that night, after the last guest had gone, they stood alone in the quiet, decorated barn. The air was filled with the sweet scent of hay and leftover cake. "We did it," Grace said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We built a family out of nothing." He kissed her forehead. "Ready for the rest of our lives?" She smiled up at him. "With you? Absolutely." He took her hand and led her back to the house. This time, she walked through the front door not as a hired wife, but as the true mistress of Hale Ranch, a beloved partner who was finally, completely home. In the months that followed, their life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Grace officially adopted Caleb and Eli, a day that filled the house with happy tears. She even started a small school for the children on the surrounding ranches, finally getting to live her dream of being a teacher. Jonathan, in turn, let go of the last of his old sorrows. He laughed more freely and let his love for his family shine through. One warm summer evening, as they sat on the porch, Jonathan looked at her. "Do you remember that first day you came here? Half frozen and scared to death?" Grace nodded. "It feels like another lifetime." He admitted, "I almost turned you away. I thought you were going to be trouble." She looked at him, curious. "Why did you not?" He smiled softly. "Because I saw something in your eyes. Even then, I saw the fight in you. I saw the woman who would one day save us." Jonathan pulled her close, his voice low. "I saw you were a fighter, stubborn as me. That is why I asked you to stay, and it was the best decision I ever made." Grace knew saying yes was hers. She came there with nothing, expecting a life without love just to survive. Now she had everything. One evening, she gathered the family with news she had held for weeks. With the boys on the rug, she sat on the arm of Jonathan's chair. "I need to tell y'all something," she announced. Caleb piped up, "Are we getting a puppy?" "Not a puppy," Grace said softly. "A someone. Next spring, you are going to have a new baby brother or sister." For a moment, there was pure silence. Then the room exploded with joy. Caleb let out a whoop. Eli's eyes were as wide as saucers. Jonathan just stared at Grace, his face a mix of joy and sheer terror. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded. "Very sure." The doctor confirmed it. "We are having a baby." Later that night, with his hand on her stomach, he admitted his fear. "I am terrified, Grace." "I know," she whispered, "but this time is different. We will be careful. I promise I will fight with everything I have to come back to you and our boys. That has to be enough for now." He kissed her. "This baby will be built from love, not just need." The pregnancy went by smoothly, and the whole ranch buzzed with excitement. The boys argued over names, and Jonathan watched over Grace with a worried love. Winter came, but it was nothing like the cold, desperate season when she first arrived. This winter was filled with the warmth of family. "It is hard to believe it has only been a year," Grace said one snowy night. Jonathan smiled. "It is because we were always meant to be a family. It just took us a while to find one another." In the early days of April, as the world turned green again, Grace's labor began. It was long and hard, and Jonathan's old fears were right there on the surface. But as the sun came up, their daughter arrived with a healthy cry. "A girl," the doctor said, placing the tiny baby in Grace's arms. Grace looked at their daughter, born from a love she never expected, and her heart felt like it would burst. "She is perfect," she whispered. Jonathan sat beside her, his finger touching the baby's tiny hand, which curled right around it. The boys tiptoed in, their eyes wide. "She is so little," Caleb said. "She is beautiful," Eli declared, his voice already protective. Grace helped him hold his new sister. "Hi there," he said softly. "I am Eli, and I am going to teach you all the important things." They named her Sarah Joy. Sarah for the mother the boys lost, and Joy for what she brought to them all. It was a bridge from the past to their future. A few weeks later, Grace found Jonathan in the nursery, rocking their daughter and singing a quiet song. He looked up when he saw her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled. "I am thinking that I love you and that this life is more than I ever dreamed of." "A year and a half ago, I was just a ghost," Jonathan said quietly. "You stumbled in out of a snowstorm and brought this whole family back to life." "You did the same for me," Grace replied. "You gave me a home and a family when I had nothing." "We saved each other," Jonathan said. "That is why this works. We built something new together." Sarah began to stir, and Grace took her to feed her. Jonathan knelt beside them, looking at his wife and new daughter. "This is my whole world right here," he said with wonder in his voice. "Our world," Grace corrected him gently. "A world we built from nothing." The years that followed had their share of hardships, from droughts to sickness, but they faced every single one of them together. A true partnership, their family strong and their love even stronger. Years later, that house was no longer quiet. It was filled with the noise and love of more children. Eli grew up serious like his father, but with his mother's love for books. He went to college back east, but always came home in the summer. Caleb, full of life, loved the ranch more than school and had a natural gift with animals. He worked side by side with Jonathan, and soon it was hard to tell who was running the place. Sarah, their first daughter, grew up smart and stubborn, honoring the past while building her own future. Through it all, Jonathan and Grace became true partners and best friends. They chose to love each other every single day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they sat in the gazebo Jonathan had built for her. The roses had grown thick and beautiful. They looked out over the valley that had become their world. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked him. "Taking a chance on me?" "Ever regret it?" Jonathan pulled her close. "Not once," she whispered. "Best bargain I ever made." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "That stopped being a bargain long time ago, Grace. This is just love." She leaned into him, watching the Texas sunset paint their land gold and rose. From the house, she could hear their loud, wonderful children, and Mrs. Brennan calling that supper was on the table. This life was better than anything he had ever planned, built from desperation but sustained by choice. "Reckon we ought to head back?" he asked. "That herd of ours will be hungry." Grace turned and gave him a soft, sweet kiss. "I just want to remember this moment," she said. "We have a lifetime of moments ahead." They walked back to the house hand in hand, two strangers who had become each other's entire world. Grace came to Hale Ranch searching for shelter, but found a home. She accepted a practical arrangement and was handed a real love story. She married a man needing a mother for his sons and became the partner to his heart and the builder to his future. And every single day she chose it all over again. Because as her friend Sarah once told her, love is a choice. Grace chose Jonathan, she chose their children, and she chose the life they built from scratch. She kept on choosing, day after day. In the end, that was what made it all real.